Oh.
The other just like. It's 4 p.m. I'll call this meeting of the executive committee to order. We are all present and smiling. This meeting was posted by the clerk's office appropriately. We'll rise for a moment of silent prayer and the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The minutes from our March 19th meeting were in the packet. Are there any corrections or comments? There being none, we'll record them as printed. The first two items, the general fund transfer update for parks and trails to brownfields and a similar transfer for replacement of cast iron pipes in the jail will be handled in the appropriate standing committees. In fact, the pipes in the jail one was already dealt with this morning in public safety. So mine is tomorrow. Yeah, and the other one will be tomorrow. So the next item is discussion item C, guidance on the joint review board participation in Germantown.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're here again to talk about another proposed tax incremental district. The packet has a lot of good information in it, the project plan, but it is in there. But it's also got some slides that the Joint Review Board and the Plan Commission for the Village of Germantown saw on the 31st of March. So a lot of good information in there about the project overall. Just wanted to take a little bit of time to just kind of talk about what's in that project. So it's TID number 10. It's being proposed by the village to pay for land acquisition, site preparation, infrastructure, and incentives required for development. So the district itself is on the corner of Pilgrim and Mequon. There's only a maps in the packet. Project is being called the Village Center. So there's some multifamily housing in there and just some general economic activity. There's sort of a central market plaza and some commercial space being proposed as part of that project as well. You know, according to the village, a project like this one was identified as a priority going back to the last time they updated their comprehensive plan. And then going forward into some community visioning sessions that they held tail end of last year and the beginning of this year. They held some sessions for the stakeholders to provide input about the site and about, you know, what might go into the village center project. Specifically, the development assumptions, they estimate about 450 multifamily units, so apartment type, high-end apartment type units, and then some about 28,000 square feet of commercial space. So again, that marketplace open concept. They're linking it to, so if you know in Mequon, the Mequon Town Center, where Cafe Hollander and Collectivo, I think, is down in there with some apartments and mixed use type things in there. They're sort of linking into that type of a development of a concept. The project is being phased. So the phases, we like to see that. That's something a lot more municipalities are doing with TIF. The phases allow for you to only initiate a certain part of the project until you can then make sure the rest of the project is economically viable. So phase 1 contains most of the residential development. Phase 2 is most of the commercial. And then phase 3 is a little bit of a mix, but it's really very conceptual at this point. Phase 3. It's so conceptual that they're actually not even projecting what the increment might generate. So it's a conservative practice that they're doing here, but phase 3 is a little bit more nebulous. it's being proposed as a rehabilitation district. So what that means is a 27-year life on the TID, rather than what we normally see with mixed use is 20 years. So this one's a little bit longer. Generally with rehab districts, there's more expense required to clean up the land or to do some remediation or something like that. And so they give those districts a little bit more time to pay off the costs by making it a 27-year life instead. The village has been acquiring land in preparation for this development. They've purchased, so they intend to basically the TID would then repay the village for the purchase price of the land and you know, the remediation if there is any, and then some of the infrastructure that they would put on that land. At least that's the description of the plan at this point. The village has purchased two properties and they're set to close on the 3rd in June. So I think some of that is also driving the carrying costs associated, are kind of driving some of the timeline on this. So that's a technical description of the TID. Couple other notes and thoughts that I had is you know, I've spoken to all of our county board supervisors that represent Germantown that gotten feedback from some of you that basically passing through some of the other feedback maybe you received from constituents or things like that. So you know, I think everybody kind of understands that there's some vocal opposition to this district or this proposal. From what and so as a result, I've been watching planning commission meetings and village board meetings and trying to get a feel for what the issues are that are out there. And I think generally there's some opposition just to the use of TIF in general. And then some opposition to the density and really in some cases the type of project overall that's being proposed. The school district has been a little bit critical of this as well. Because of the impact that apartments can have on a school when they're talking about staffing and revenue impacts and the timing of how when folks move into apartments and how that can drive the timing of when they need to hire teachers and things like that. So the school district has been you know, keeping an eye on this district as well. And then we know that this did turn into an elections issue in the village as well, right? So it seems pretty clear that it was a topic of discussion or a topic in people's minds when they went to the polls. So on Monday, the Village Plan Commission they held a public hearing before they then eventually approved and passed the resolution on to the village board. The village board is set to consider this at its April 21st meeting. I did get assurances that the new board will be seated prior to this meeting. It will not be the outgoing board that's voting on this, but on their way out, it's the new board that would be voting on this. I know that was a concern that was out there. So if it does pass at the village level, then it comes to the joint review board. Our meeting is set to occur on May 12th. I think from my perspective, we're faced again with, as the joint review board, we're faced with making a decision on approving a TID. In terms of timeline, it's a little bit difficult because there's still some unknowns out there, and there always will be to some extent, but this is the second time here in a row, really, where we've been faced with having to cast a vote without. There's some more information that would be useful, I think, but it just won't materialize between now and then. I think phase one being mostly residential, the village has demonstrated that phase one alone, the funding works out for phase one alone. So the apartment portion of the project. The funding, the cash flow works. The district would close prior to the end of the statutory life, and it would work. Phase two, if you look closely at the project plan, phase two is showing about $6 million short on revenue to make the overall project happen. So there's a known gap of $6 million in this project. So they would need to come up with $6 million of revenue or $6 million in expense reductions or offsets to even make that project work within those 27 years. So that, you know, the planning commission picked up on that and asked for some ideas on how they might close that $6 million gap. You know, they identified a number of options, including grants and land sale. The land sale pricing might be conservative, and there might be infrastructure that gets financed by a developer. So there's a number of things that might materialize, but we just don't, we're just not in a spot to see that they have, right? So a lot of what ifs out there for that $6 million. I wouldn't expect the village to initiate phase two without closing that gap. They're fiscally responsible in that regard, and I don't expect them to do that. Phase two is also sort of contingent on 2 properties in the district selling. And if they don't, then that sort of leaves a gap in the plan, with some land that they can't develop. So that's another way where phase two may not happen. And so my concern with this is that phase one is the only viable option going forward. And now we're stuck with sort of a residential tip, right? You know, if that happens, the Germantown community doesn't get the village center and marketplace that they identified in those visioning sessions. But we also know that residential TIF impacts the village and the school when it draws more students or more service needs or things like that, right? And when we approve TIF, sometimes we can see those things as necessary to get the type of development that we want. But to possibly face those types of impacts without those desired benefits, I think that's something we should consider as we're casting our vote on the joint review board. So I wanted to lay out sort of the facts and some of my observations and concerns, and then hopefully get some of your comments, questions.
I'll start out with, if I assume that phase two, the market plots, is what the public wanted. They didn't go ask for more apartments. They asked for the village square area.
I believe the visioning session identified a mix, sort of an overall mix, but that's probably what's accurate.
And now that they've come this far, the bank and the gas station would benefit from a whole bunch of apartments around them. So what's the point of them selling? And if they do, the price will probably go up. I mean, there are assumptions, so your $6 million gap, or their 6 million, becomes a greater gap. So I'm very troubled by all of this. And I know a lot of the constituents are, so that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Yeah, so just for clarification, and again, this thing was, like we discussed before, was 84 million. So you're saying 90 plus is what they're looking at now, right? Am I looking at that right?
If you add it to the expense side, it would grow by that.
Sure, well, right.
If you took it off the revenue side, it would stay. So
Okay.
Could net it increase higher or gross it up, but there's a number of options.
Yeah, I guess my opinion is I'm gonna listen to the people who represent that district and take their advice. So thank you.
Supervisor Schulteis.
Yes, I have heard from, several of my constituents as well, and I think, just for feedback, you talked about there in the schools and the importance of measuring that accurately, then I believe they're waiting on 2 reports. Inventories of sorts that haven't come in yet are due in May.
The first one is in, the second one is coming in early.
Okay, yes, and that information would be extremely helpful for them, according to my constituents. The other is just the general comment of, the sense of feeling, not included in some of the information that, there were meetings that were held that weren't, perhaps, this is according to, feedback I've received, that weren't held according to open meeting, requests and such. So, there are people that want to be heard and it appears that they feel if they haven't been heard completely.
Thank you for that, and I don't know about the allegations around, open meetings and whatnot, but I can say that from the plan commission meetings I watched, that was definitely the sentiment by the public comment that I heard, so.
Supervisor Kelly.
The high density housing, is that these giant apartment buildings that we see everywhere?
I think the tallest one was 5 stories.
And, been my experience, this is not a place you're gonna raise kids. I don't know that this is gonna affect the school district that much. I mean, you don't wanna be lugging a stroller up, 10 flights of stairs, and your groceries and all the rest of that. I mean, it just doesn't happen. You don't see kids living there. Most of the time, you're gonna see retirees or professionals. That's been the experience here at the district and even at some of the other places we built here in West. Some things about this district, I guess I understand the people, first of all, when you say, well, the open record, the open meetings, violations and things like that, you know what, we hear that all. Cover of darkness, backroom deals, I have no doubt that Germantown did their due diligence and properly notified these meetings and held them, according to the statutes. I just don't put a lot of faith in the fact that people can say what they want because they didn't see the paper or they didn't hear it on the radio or whatever. I don't believe the school is an issue. I looked at this thing pretty closely, and to be quite honest, the houses are going to be built in the first phase. That part looks pretty good, just like what we had here in West Bend. And at least in phase 2, with where the location is a really good retail location. Unlike what we had in our district here in West Bend, where it was out in the middle of nowhere where nobody goes. This one actually seems viable as commercial space and retail space. And understand, for those of you who might be watching at home, I live in West Bend. I have no dog in this fight. I'm just calling it as I really see it. I would be very troubled with the gap. I did catch that, saw the red on there, and I'm like, oh, that's a problem. And I don't know how that figures in for you as far as you're doing these meetings. But I would say you need to have plans. I don't think this project in and of itself is all that bad. Certainly not the same as what I was looking at in West Bend for that kid district. This one looks like it's doable, but the numbers aren't there. And that would be my concern.
Thank you for that, and yeah, I think that's sort of what I was alluding to is, phase 1 works out financially, but we're also tasked as a joint review board with determining if this is the type of development that our county or our community or our municipality, if it aligns with the overall need. And so I just wanted to make sure that I bring those concerns up too.
Supervisor Trump.
Thank you. Can you make a recommendation to break it out and just do phase 1? Or is this one packet all or nothing?
Well, they would only initiate it phase by phase. Us approving the district allows them to do all the phases.
Okay.
In whatever, you know, as soon as they would like, but just, I mean, knowing the village. I would, I mean, it would be really problematic to just go up, you know, go out on your own and do this.
Well, I get it, but I was just wondering if you were at the meeting, you could say, hey, we strongly, you know, we approve phase one, but we're kind of, until you figure out the financing for the rest of it, we do not agree with the rest of the phases at this point. Can you make that motion or?
Well, by approving it, we authorize them to do.
Yeah.
It's an all, or none. So we're not allowed to modify the project and.
Okay.
From my I guess what I would like for you all to consider is if all we get is phase one. Are we okay with that? The apartments only and that's it. Cause that is a possibility based on the gap in the plan.
Yeah, well, then again, how these work, best, people who represent the district.
Supervisor Schwab.
Two questions, and you may probably not have an answer to the first. If phase two is basically the part that the people wanted, and that was commercial, how much empty retail space is there in Germantown right now? Is there a demand for more? And if there is, then maybe we could see our way clear, or maybe I could see my way clear to supporting. On the other hand, if it is only going to be a residential facility, apartment owners are making a killing right now. We should not be supporting a tax increment district that is only residential at a time like this. Surely the developer, in my mind, ought to bear those costs.
I did not see demand statistics for the commercial space. We saw some on the residential side, on the housing side, but we did not see it.
Is there any thought on the residential for some of them to be condominiums, owner occupied units?
I don't know exactly, but I suspect that they need the density to make the space work and the numbers work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One other question too, I noticed that the reasoning they put behind is blighted. As the property being blighted, do you think that that was an accurate description of that property? It didn't seem that way. I mean, they're actually buying a bank and a flower store and, this medical center. That doesn't sound blighted to me.
It was described as blighted, it was described as some remediation is necessary. That was actually a question. So their plan commission actually was set to approve this at one meeting, and it actually got delayed till the meeting on Monday. Because they wanted them to dig in a little bit more on that concept. So they then on Monday showed them a map of all of the potential, you know, because there's a ratio, right? A certain portion of it needs to be in need of things like that. So they walked through that. So I am a little bit more confident in that. I mentioned it to Chairman Schleif this afternoon. I think the flower source might actually have some remediation that needs to be done on that site.
And that was the area that I think they referred to as blighted, you know, it's been a vacant property for a couple of years. And it was starting to have vandalism and such, so.
I mean, but they did actually, the whole project, as I see here, is based on blight. Well, that's the flower store. That seems to be a bit of a stretch.
It's on a percentage basis. My memory is not, I'm not able to recall exactly what the percentage requirements are, but that's what they walked through on Monday night was a certain percent needs to be eligible for this.
Okay, and again, I understand that we're here basically just giving guidance and advice. We're not actually voting on whether or not we should go through with it or anything like that. But those are some of the concerns that I had with the thing, but overall, I think if the full project went through, I think it would probably benefit Germantown. But I think it's actually, other than the financials, which is always, the problem. It looks like a project that could be very successful, and I did think about the one over, down Mequon Road there in Mequon. That's a very thriving area there, as well as Bay Shore too. It's along those lines as well, though not as big. And I know that area fairly well. It's fairly populous. It's easy to get to. So, I mean, if they can make the numbers work, and I feel that it could be an okay project.
We just need more details to be sure, and I'm sure you feel the same way. Who makes up the joint review board?
There's a representative, a representative from the village, typically the village president, but it's here to be someone else. The county, the technical college, in the case of Germantown, it's Milwaukee, MATC. The school board or the school district, and then a citizen member.
So, like you said, if the financials work on phase one, I'm still troubled by the financial goal with phase two, and the fact that phase two is the part that most of the citizens want
And they may never get there.
because of the money and the other properties they have to get. This is a tough one to vote yes for, I think, but, if you want our guidance.
Lots of rock.
A hard maybe.
It's not very definite.
I do appreciate all the input. I mean, we've got another 4 to 3 weeks for new information to even materialize, I think, between now and then. So, but I do appreciate the input tonight.
And you being the conscientious representative you are, I know you'll take all the additional information and digest it, so.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've been watching way too many village meetings for me.
And they're riveting.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
So was that the feedback you need?
It is, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then you can move on to the discussion on what happens if there's no state budget.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mentioned a lot of these points the other night, but we really wanted to just kind of drive home the fact that we're preparing as if the state doesn't have a budget on time for us. So with that, with a normal state budget, there's always certain policy items that they fund, but in our case, we're also relying on the cost to continue portion of their funding, right? Even if they just fund our COLAs, right? That's important to us. And so without a state budget, we're planning as if we're sort of going it alone in that regard. So that's the reason for us shifting a higher percentage of sales tax into the operating budget, right? So again, about $650,000 of new sales tax shifting into the operating budget in anticipation of us needing to fund a significant portion of that gap. Our gap is about $1.4 to $1.5 million without factoring significant inflation in there, right? The 1.4 is mostly our salaries, our normal increases in salaries and wages. There's some inflationary impacts built in, but nothing like we had seen in recent history. That's that 1.4 number doesn't even take into account some of the other priority items that we might want to fund, including $1 million for at least $1 million for fire and EMS to make that permanent. Or as an example of a priority item we'll need to consider here in the budget process. So, I mentioned that at county board, how the school districts are typically a driver of that timeline and so. Again, that sense of urgency is just not there and I would expect that the legislature does pass a budget. But it's likely that it happens with some sort of a poison pill or something in there that the governor won't sign, right? So they'll each have their own versions of the budget and there will be no approved budget per se. So that's our concern. Again, we're under these circumstances, we're giving consideration to all scenarios, right? So including using net new construction to increase the levy as an example. So we're expecting that would be another 500 to 600,000 of additional revenue. So that would even still, that would leave us with a couple $100,000 of a gap to close. So you know, I mentioned the other night, we approached department heads about 5, 10, 15% cut scenarios. We know that across the board doesn't usually work, but we're scenario planning, right? So I don't imagine a scenario where everybody is tasked with exactly the same percentage, right? But we're at this point having those discussions about what sorts of policy considerations and policy impacts this might have, because you know we're a little bit further than just you know not doing that training here or something like that, right? There's some policy impacts that this would have, service delivery impacts that this would have, and so we're identifying those scenarios now. I'm going to meet with every department head and we're going to talk about their budgets and about what sorts of options might be out there and just kind of identify all of that comes from those conversations. You can expect additional updates here in the coming months, and then obviously our budget process allows for a lot of that good discussion too. But are there any questions that you have about this process?
From a 40,000 foot view, our budget year to year is about,
125 million?
how much of that comes from the state? Roughly.
About 40%. About 40%.
And if there's no state budget, we don't know if that 40% is coming, how much of it is, what might be cut, what might not. So we're really dealing with a ton of unknowns.
There's some unknowns. We suspect that they would fund, you know, the base level funding would just continue, but there would be no targeted growth for us to apply to our cost of living adjustments or anything like that. That's what we suspect. Now, the federal government is another question that's out there as well, right? And I think that the state might be waiting for additional information from them as they're formulating their budgets. So
everybody's playing a waiting game.
would be.
Real quick, my understanding with the state budget is if they don't pass the budget, it resorts back to the previous year, and that continues, right?
That's my understanding.
So that's what we know we have coming then, right?
We
Kind of.
suspect that that's
Okay.
what we have coming.
Another big fat maybe.
Well, we're not planning for a cut. I guess that would be a nightmare scenario, but
Sure.
we're not planning for that.
Okay.
And the revenue sharing of the sales tax will continue.
Correct. That's assumed in our cost to continue number.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Great.
Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you.
Our last item is 2025 ordinance, tax deed sales, 49-10. Motion by Supervisor Chadron, second by Supervisor Schulteis. This will be explained as we go through it by Stern.
So we have before you a brand new shiny hot off the press tax deed ordinance, which will have the effect of repealing the current ordinance, which is located in chapter 49 of the code, and replace it with what you see before you. And I'm going to give you just a kind of a quick sort of overview of this new ordinance and what it does, and give you a little context for it. This ordinance springs from 2023 Act 207. Act 207 was passed and signed by the governor in March of 24 in response to a U.S. Supreme Court decision that came down from Minnesota. It was a case called Tyler versus Hennepin County. And in that particular case, Hennepin County foreclosed on a piece of property Geraldine owned. Geraldine Tyler was her name, and she owed $15,000 in back taxes. It was a condo. They took the condo and they sold it for $40,000. Under Minnesota law, the county was able to keep the entire $40,000. Geraldine sued because she said that $25,000 in equity that she had was her property, and that the law was unconstitutional under the Fifth Amendment and the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So it was an unlawful taking of her property without due process under the Fifth Amendment. Under the Eighth Amendment, what you had was an excessive fine. In other words. So the lower court said, no, not unconstitutional, county can keep the money. The Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals in the Eighth District agreed with the lower court and said, yeah, the county can keep that money. But the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and unanimously decided, no, that was an unconstitutional taking of Geraldine's property. So Wisconsin, up until Act 207, had a very similar law. And the idea was that the legislature wanted to pass something kind of quick to get us in line with the U.S. Supreme Court decision, and that's where Act 207 comes from. The purpose of the new law is really twofold. Number one, it's to make sure that the county's not getting any more money than it rightfully has come to it when it takes the property through the tax deed process or tax foreclosure process. That's the first thing. The second thing it wants to do is make sure that there's a clear process for how a former owner of the property can get that property back. Okay, and that's what Act 207 attempts to do. Now, the thing about Act 207, what you should know is, what I'm going to walk you through a little bit here, really only pertains to what they call single family owner occupied residences. Right? Wouldn't apply to, like, for example, vacant piece of property that somebody owns. This law wouldn't apply to it. However, what the law does say is that the county has the discretion to apply this law to all of the property that it takes, regardless of whether it's single owner occupied. Okay. I haven't, Scott's here and Ashley, we're the kind of the private people these things. I think probably it would behoove us to apply this process to all of the tax deeds. It would create uniformity for us to work with. And I have a sneaky feeling that I wouldn't be surprised if sometime down the road, even these vacant lots, somebody's going to file a lawsuit and claim that the property is being unlawfully taken and we don't give back the surplus. And quite frankly, there is a lawsuit going on right now in the state of Wisconsin. We are a party to that lawsuit. All the counties are being sued. I don't want to get into that lawsuit on an open session here, but we have outside counsel. All the counties are working together to fight the lawsuit. But it's a very similar lawsuit to the Minnesota case, alleging taking property through the years doesn't belong to us. So, but again, we won't get into that today, but just to give you sort of a taste for what's going on. It's a very serious situation. So the new law, Act 207, requires the county, I should say, to either adopt an ordinance or pass a resolution that spells out the new requirements in the law concerning the disposition of tax deed proceeds. Because we already have an ordinance on books, it seems to make more sense, in my opinion, that we pass a new ordinance versus just a resolution that gets stuck in a proceeding book that people might miss. By passing an ordinance, we have it right in our code as to what procedures are, process is, and something as serious as taking somebody's property should be codified so that everybody can take a look and see exactly what their rights are and what our obligations are and so forth. So that's why I advocate for an ordinance change we already had an ordinance on the books, this continues that precedent, I think it's a good precedent, yeah. Now, some of the changes you'll notice in this ordinance, and then looking at it, it really is not a very lengthy ordinance, quite honestly. But there's some parts of it that are pretty important, that I wanted to bring to your attention this afternoon as well. So once the county initiates the tax deed process, what you should know in this particular ordinance is that the county board is delegating the authority to acquire and sell and manage those properties, delegating that authority to each center. Normally, what you're used to right now is seeing tax deed properties come before, I think, this committee and then to the county board for disposition, but under the new law, the executive committee handles all that. All that sale, approves everything, probably doesn't see the county board, maybe very rare occasion perhaps, but generally speaking, everything will take place here in front of the executive committee now. Now, once the county takes property by tax, several wheels go into motion at the same time to walk through it. Within 30 days of the acquisition of the land by tax deed, the treasurer has to give notice to the former owner that he or she may be entitled to some surplus proceeds, so that happens. Meanwhile, within 120 days of the acquisition, the executive committee must get together and determine the appraised value of the property. This is something new, to determine the appraised value of the property. In the past, we've talked about, what do you set the sale price at, okay? And usually, I think we've set it, actually, correct me if I'm wrong, at the taxes that are owed. Okay,
correct.
Not any longer under the new law. The new law says we have to get an appraisal of that property. How you choose to do that is up to you. You can do it through an appraiser. You can do it through whatever other means that you feel are appropriate. We can get into that at some point down the road, I suppose. But what we have been warned is going by assessed value, which is of course different than appraised value most of the time, may not be adequate because oftentimes assessed value is going to be lower than appraised value. So we have to give an honest look at this and say, what are these properties worth? And then that's what we got to sell it for, or post it for, I should say, because that's something new. Within 30 days of the acquisition, here's the third thing that's going on at the time. My office must send a letter notifying the former owner of the right to repurchase the property and how to go about doing that if they so choose. And the way they have to do that is to pay all of the county's expenses related to taking the property and listing it and all those things that go along with it. And also obviously pay the property taxes that are due. Prior property taxes, one of the property taxes that are currently owed. Now, if they are able to repurchase that property, then what's going to happen is, third, my office, we give the property deeded back to the former owner, and it's simple as that. Now, there's a little bit of a point of law I want to call out to you in this process. Again, these are all new things in the law, and obviously, I don't think you're going to memorize this, and I'm not going to get a test you on it later, but this is give you a flavor of what's happening here. What state statute says is there's yet another loophole the former property owner has to jump through before we can get the property back. And that is they have to prove to us that any liens on that property are paid off. So if there's a judgment against them because they didn't pay a credit card bill and they were sued and there's a lien on the property as a result of that, under state law, they would have to show to us that they also paid that off in addition to their taxes. So in other words, they got to pay off everything that's owed on that property before we can give the property back to their state law. Now, I saw that in the statute, and that bothered me. And so I contacted Representative Rob Brooks, who sponsored and authored this legislation, and Attorney Andy Phillips of the County Association. And I told him, I think you got a problem here with this particular rule. And let me explain what that problem is. I jotted some notes down about it. If you take a look at that Tyler decision, what it says is the county isn't supposed to take any more money than it has coming to it. So our role is to make the taxpayer whole by collecting those property taxes, okay? under the way I drafted this ordinance, if they pay their property taxes, what's gonna happen is any prior liens around that property that were extinguished when we took the property are reinstated by law, okay? We're not gonna become the collection agency for the credit card companies, the hospitals, whomever, and try to chase around these liens, find out who's got a legitimate lien, try to find out if the lien was paid off, try to find out if it was, if there's something we missed, and, that puts us in a problem where we're spending resources and staff time and so forth, that really has nothing to do with what taxpayer owes, to pay off that tax that they have. And the reason that's important is because when we take a piece of property like taxing, we create a new title in that property. So by law, typically, all other liens are wiped out, except for the IRS liens when we take a piece of property. Okay, and what the legislature was afraid of was that people were going to let their property go into tax foreclosure. We take it, wipe out all the liens, and then they bid on the property, get it back or purchase it back, lien free. That wasn't the intention of the law. What I suggested to the legislature, to Rob Brooks and Andy Phillips, was that why don't you just build what I did in our ordinance into the law? And they agreed that's a good idea, and that's what they think. That they're gonna do that. We're hopefully gonna put some cleanup legislation together. There's some bigger fish to fry right now with budgets and so forth, but some of that cleanup legislation is coming. I've talked to them about it. So we're a little bit ahead of the game in our ordinance, but they also agreed that's really a bad deal for everybody to have to try to chase down these liens. It's actually also a bad deal for the creditor, and it's a bad deal for the property owner. Because if they don't prove to us that those liens are paid off, we don't give them the property back. Well, what happens in that case? Well, those liens are wiped out. So the creditor actually is worse off because their liens go away forever, right? If we reinstate them, they get their lien back. But what's also bad is the property owner loses their property. And yeah, they should have paid their property taxes and so forth, and that's why we're doing this process. But the law's intended to give them a chance to get that property back, and we're not in the business of taking people's property from them, putting them out on the streets from the help, right? We just want to get the taxes paid. That's what they have, that's their obligation, and we shouldn't be taking these properties and selling them off to somebody else. They should get the property back. I can only imagine the devastating consequences that could happen to somebody if they can't pay their property back, get their property back rather, because they've got some liens out there that are $40,000-$50,000 they can't satisfy. There'll come a time for those creditors to satisfy those liens down the road when those properties are sold in another form. So everybody's a loser in that regard. The lien holders lose their liens, taxpayers lose their property, and we've taken somebody's property really that we're not supposed to take. There are circumstances we shouldn't take. Our ordinance doesn't do that. So a little bit of a detour, but I want to explain to you how this was written. And Chairman Schleich asked me earlier today, where does that appear? That appears in section, I think, what do we say, 3C3? No, didn't go with the way I drafted it. Now let's say, for example, a party can't purchase their property back. What happens next? Well, the property goes to auction. We work with Wisconsin Surplus. What the law says now is that if somebody bids less than the appraised value, we cannot approve that sale. We have to put it back up for auction a second time. And then if it comes back for less than the appraised value, then the executive committee can decide to take the bid most advantageous to the county and sell it at that point. But this does put this requirement on us now that you gotta sell it for the appraised value, nothing less than that. At least the first time around. If there are surplus proceeds, then of course the treasurer is supposed to send those proceeds off to the prior owner. If we can't find the prior owner after a year, then those are considered abandoned funds and kind of takes at that point. So that's how that works in terms of perhaps they can't find the prior owner. So that's essentially what the new law looks like. And there's some technicalities in here that Ashley and Scott and I have to deal with as we move along. But that's what we're hoping you'll approve, and we'll take the full county board next month and give them their vote.
Thank you. In the interest of efficiency, we get the appraisal first before it's auctioned, and post what the appraised value is, or do we have to wait until, see what the legitimate bids are?
I think we gotta get the appraised value first,
Okay.
you know.
Good.
That's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
And we may experiment a little bit with this as we get going the first time shortly, but we're gonna work together to do best we can, make sure you have very little concern.
Yeah, the first one's gonna be agonizing, I imagine.
A learning curve.
And then following up on that, you'd mentioned that oftentimes the assessed value is lower. There are a lot of communities that don't follow up with the assessors on a regular basis, keep their tax bases appropriate, which has a greater effect on, the county as the taxes as well. I think this is another example of if there's any way that the county can look at it. If this is a way by which we can say that we have to do legitimate appraisals so that we are collecting the appropriate taxes as it affects our county taxes. Maybe this actually works in our benefit. I mean,
Well,
that's kind of a sideways way of going about it,
Yeah.
but it might work in our.
the idea behind getting a legitimate appraisal is that essentially the terminology you might hear is equity theft, that if we undervalue the property, we're basically stealing the equity out of these homes, which was not the intention, obviously.
No, that wasn't the intention, right? It may be a side benefit.
Right. You're right.
But then to build on that, the cost of doing the appraisal is part of the fees we're allowed to charge, correct?
Right.
Where's it going?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that I did want to mention, because I come from a whole family of contractors, is a lot of times those liens are coming from contractors. And really, it's about the only tool that these small businessmen have to recoup their losses, and usually they don't. I mean, they end up out several $1,000s by people who have contractors come into their home, get the work done, and then refuse to pay them. Litigation takes forever and is expensive, and really the only thing they have is a lien. So thank you for looking out for them. That is something that I think 9 times out of 10, it's not some big fancy bank. It's just some guy with a van who put a new roof on your house and or did, repaired your furnace and air conditioning or something like that. They're small business people that need our protection as well.
That's right, that's the only way they're gonna collect is someday if the house is sold to get that property out, get that lien out, that sale. If we wipe them out, they don't get it back, they're out,
Right? It could be 20 years before they even see a dime of that.
right? And then the lien only lasts so long, you have to renew it in certain cases, and if you forget, time passes by.
And the lien is for a specific amount. If you wait 10 years, you don't get interest, you don't get any benefit from inflation. You just get the amount.
Well, it depends, if there's a judgment, sometimes there'll be interest tacked onto that and so forth, but. I just think that the way the law was written, it just sets everybody up to lose, and I did call that out, and when I talked to Representative Brooks about it, he said, yeah, you're right, we didn't think of it that way, so. They are gonna repair it at some point, so is our ordinance directly in compliance with the laws written out? No, but I think what we're doing in passing this actually protects the county.
Once again, Washington counties and we,
Yeah.
it's what we do. Any further discussion or questions?
I think I got it done, right?
There being none, we'll vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent interpretation.
A little while, I want to get you to this.
That concludes our business tonight. Our next meeting date is May 21st, 2025 at 4:00 p.m.